It's Monday morning. Your alarm goes off, and for exactly one merciful second, you don't remember that you have a job. Then it hits you, all at once, like a truck made of obligations. You've got 40 hours ahead of you, 5 days, a commute, a boss, a calendar full of meetings that could have been, and honestly should have been, an email. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet, exhausted voice asks the question you never actually stop to answer. Why? Why 40 hours? Why 5 days? Who decided this was the deal? Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. For the vast majority of human existence, nobody worked like this. Not close. Anthropologists who've spent real time with modern hunter-gatherer societies, the kind of communities that still live something close to how our ancestors lived for a few 100,000 years, keep finding the same shocking number over and over again. Somewhere between 15 and 20 hours a week. That's it. That's the whole work week. Hunting, gathering, building shelter, making tools, the entire survival package, done in less time than most of us spend answering Slack messages. So somewhere between then and now, something happened. Something took a species that worked maybe 2.5, 3 hours a day and turned it into a species that sets an alarm, straps on a badge, and hands over 8 hours of its one and only life, 5 days a week, to somebody else. And the story of how that happened isn't really about economics, even though it looks like economics. It's about power. It's about kings and priests and grain and the extremely old, extremely uncomfortable idea that once somebody figures out how to control your time, they've basically figured out how to control you. Let's go back and actually trace it, because the real answer is stranger, older, and a lot more relevant to your Monday than you'd expect. Let's start with what natural human work actually looked like, because it's almost nothing like what we assume. The anthropologist Richard Lee spent years documenting the Juhoansi of the Kalahari Desert in the 1960s, actually counting hours, actually following people around with a clipboard, and what he found became one of the most famous studies in the field. Adults worked around 2 to 3 hours a day gathering and hunting food. The rest of the time was spent resting, socializing, telling stories, doing basically nothing in particular. The anthropologist Marshall Salins looked at data like this from hunter-gatherer societies around the world and coined a phrase that still makes economists uncomfortable: the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more stuff. Affluent because they wanted less, worked less, and had more time than almost anyone alive today. And here's the detail that really matters, the one that explains everything that comes next. Hunter-gatherers didn't work more because they physically couldn't, not because they were lazy, not because survival was easy, but because there was no point. You can't accumulate wealth when you have to carry everything you own on your back every few weeks. There's no bank vault in a nomadic camp. If you kill more meat than your group can eat before it spoils, you don't hoard it, you share it. Because sharing is the only storage system that actually works when you're moving constantly. Nobody could get rich, and if nobody can get rich, nobody has a reason to make anyone else work harder than survival requires. No boss, no overtime, no quarterly targets, just enough, and then rest. So, what changed? One word, and it's not the word you'd expect: grain. About 12,000 years ago, in scattered pockets across the world, humans started deliberately planting wheat and barley and rice, instead of just foraging for whatever grew wild. This gets taught in school as an obvious, unambiguous upgrade. Humanity discovers farming, humanity gets smarter, humanity moves forward. But the anthropologist and political scientist James C. Scott spent decades studying the earliest states, and his conclusion is almost the opposite of the textbook version. Farming, in his telling, wasn't humanity leveling up. It was humanity walking into a trap, and grain was the bait. Here's why grain specifically matters, and this is the detail that changes the entire story. Think about a root vegetable, something like a wild yam or a tuber. It grows underground. It ripens at different times. You can leave it in the dirt for months and dig it up whenever you actually need it. Nobody can tax a yam, because nobody can see it, count it, or predict when you're going to harvest it. Grain is the exact opposite. It ripens all at once, above ground, in a field, on a predictable schedule that anyone standing on a nearby hill can watch happen. It can be measured in baskets. It can be stored in a granary. It can be counted, confiscated, and rationed out later. Scott has a phrase for this. He calls grain legible, which is a strange word to use about a crop, until you realize what it actually means. Readable by a state, visible to power. For the first time in human history, there was something worth stealing, that you couldn't just pack up and walk away with. And once there's something worth stealing, somebody shows up to steal it. This is where the second piece of the puzzle comes in. The piece the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe wrote about back in the 1950s when he coined the term the urban revolution. Once farmers started producing more grain than they needed to survive, That extra grain, that surplus, made something entirely new possible. It made it possible for some people to stop farming altogether. Priests who didn't grow food, soldiers who didn't grow food, scribes, administrators, kings, none of them growing a single stalk of wheat, all of them eating quite well, because they'd figured out how to take a cut of everyone else's harvest. Civilization, in the sense of cities and temples and monuments and kings, isn't possible without a surplus. And a surplus isn't possible without grain. And grain, unlike the wandering hunter-gatherer life that came before it, requires a fixed address, a fixed schedule, and, crucially, people willing or forced to keep producing it on somebody else's timeline. This is the exact moment human labor stopped being something you did for yourself and started being something somebody else could schedule. Let's look at how this actually played out, because the evidence is remarkably specific, and honestly kind of chilling once you see the pattern. Take ancient Egypt. For a long time, popular imagination pictured the pyramids being built by armies of enslaved people under the whip. Decades of archaeological work at Giza, particularly the excavation of a nearby workers' village, led by the Egyptologist Mark Lehner, tells a more complicated story. The builders weren't primarily slaves. Many were farmers, conscripted through a rotating labor obligation, essentially a tax paid in time instead of grain. And the timing wasn't random. It happened during the Nile's annual flood season, the months when farmland was underwater, and agricultural work was physically impossible anyway. The state didn't just extract labor, it extracted labor precisely when farmers had nothing else to do, which meant the state, not the farmer, decided how those months of a person's life would be spent. Workers were housed, fed, and rationed bread and beer in exchange for their labor. It wasn't slavery in the classical sense. It was something arguably more important for our story. It was the birth of scheduled, quota-based, state-organized labor, backed not by chains, but by the simple fact that the king controlled the grain, and therefore controlled the calendar. Mesopotamia tells an almost identical story from a different angle. In the temple and palace economies of Sumer, and later the Ur-3 period, archaeologists have recovered thousands of clay tablets that are, essentially, ancient HR records, ration lists, labor rosters, records of workers organized into gangs, assigned tasks, paid in fixed quantities of barley and oil based on output and attendance. If that sounds uncomfortably close to a modern payroll system, that's because it functionally is one. The temple didn't own these workers as property in every case, but it owned their time, tracked their attendance, and controlled their food supply, which in practice amounts to almost the same thing. This is one of the earliest documented examples in human history of labor being treated as a measurable, schedulable resource rather than something a person simply did on their own terms. Then there's a system that might be the clearest example of all. The Inca Mita. The Inca Empire, stretching across the Andes, ran on a form of taxation almost nobody has to think about today, because we've replaced it with something so similar it's easy to miss the connection. Instead of paying tribute in goods, subjects of the empire owed the state a set number of days of labor per year, building roads, farming state land, working in mines, constructing terraces and storehouses. This labor was rotated across the population, tracked using knotted cord records called quipu, and it built the literal infrastructure of one of the largest empires in the ancient world. The Mita wasn't hidden or disguised as anything else. It was, explicitly, on the record, a tax paid in time. You didn't owe the Sapa Inca grain. You owed him hours. China ran a version of the same system for over 2,000 years, called corvée labor, or yaoyi. Peasant households owed the imperial state a fixed number of labor days annually, and it's genuinely hard to overstate what that obligation built. Sections of the Great Wall. The Grand Canal, one of the largest engineering projects in the pre-modern world, dug largely by conscripted peasant labor working state-assigned quotas. Dynasty after dynasty adjusted the exact terms, sometimes allowing wealthier households to pay a substitute or a fee instead of showing up in person, which is, if you think about it for a second, essentially the ancient prototype of paying someone else to cover your shift. The obligation itself rarely disappeared. It just got a bit more negotiable for whoever could afford it. Notice the pattern forming here. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Inca Empire, Imperial China, 4 civilizations with no contact with each other, arriving at almost the identical solution. Once a ruling class exists, and it needs labor it doesn't want to perform itself, it doesn't ask nicely. It builds a system, a quota, a rotation, a schedule, that converts a person's time into a resource the state can plan around. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was, in the coldest possible sense, good management. You cannot build a pyramid, a ziggurat, a network of Andean roads, or a wall that stretches across an entire continent on the unpredictable whims of people showing up whenever they feel like it. You need reliability. You need hours you can count on. And once kings figured out how to guarantee that reliability, the idea of a person's time belonging, at least partially, to someone else, was locked into human civilization for good. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and the system gets even more explicit, almost bureaucratically so. Under feudalism, a serf typically owed the local lord a fixed number of days of labor each week, often 2 or 3, working the lord's fields, maintaining the lord's roads, doing the lord's harvest, before ever getting to their own strip of land. Historians call this week work, and it was written into manorial records with the specificity of a modern employment contract. Miss your obligated days, and there were real, enforceable consequences. In exchange, the serf got protection and the right to farm a small plot for themselves. It's not slavery, and it's not quite a job either. It's something in between, a formalized, calendarized claim on a person's time, owed upward to whoever held power over the land. And this is where something genuinely important starts to shift. Something the historian E.P. Thompson wrote about in a landmark essay in 1967 called Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism. Thompson pointed out that for most of human history, including most of the medieval period, ordinary people worked according to what he called task orientation. You milked the cow when the cow needed milking. You harvested when the crop was ready. Time was measured by the job, not the clock, because most people didn't own a clock, and honestly didn't need one. Church bells rang for prayer, not for punctuality. Work expanded and contracted with the seasons, the weather, the daylight, the task itself. Clock time, the idea that your day should be divided into precise, uniform, interchangeable hours, and that you owe a specific number of those hours to somebody else regardless of whether the work is actually done, is a much newer invention than most people assume. And it didn't emerge to make life easier. It emerged because it made large groups of people easier to schedule, supervise, and extract labor from its scale. Which brings us to the moment the 40-hour week, as we now know it, was actually born, and it happened surprisingly recently, and surprisingly deliberately. The Industrial Revolution took Thompson's clock time idea and pushed it to a genuinely brutal extreme. Early factories in 18th and 19th century Britain and America didn't run on anything resembling a 40-hour week. 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days were standard, 6 days a week, enforced by time clocks, fines for lateness, and factory bells that dictated every movement of a worker's day with a precision no medieval lord ever managed. Owning a factory meant owning, almost completely, the waking hours of everyone inside it. Workers, understandably, pushed back. By the early 1800s, the labor reformer Robert Owen was circulating a slogan that became one of the defining demands of the entire labor movement. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. It took over a century of strikes, organizing, and in some cases outright violent confrontation, before that slogan became anything close to policy. And then, almost accidentally, a car manufacturer got there first. In 1926, Henry Ford implemented a 5-day, 40-hour week at the Ford Motor Company, and it's worth being honest about why. It wasn't generosity. Ford's own reasoning, on the record, was that well-rested workers were more productive per hour, and that workers with 2 full days off would actually go out and spend money, including on cars. The 40-hour week wasn't handed down as a gift. It was calculated as a more efficient way to extract value from a worker's time, dressed up as a benefit. 12 years later, in 1938, the United States made it federal law with the Fair Labor Standards Act, formally locking the 40-hour week into the American economy, and much of the industrialized world followed a similar pattern over the following decades. So here's where all of this actually lands, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The 40-hour week feels permanent. It feels like a law of nature, like something that was always going to happen once civilization got advanced enough. It isn't. It's the current version of a negotiation that started the moment grain became legible enough to tax, roughly 12,000 years ago. Egyptian farmers conscripted during flood season. Mesopotamian laborers tracked on clay ration tablets. Inca subjects owing days instead of goods. Medieval serfs bound to week work. Factory workers timed by the bell and the clock. Every single one of these systems is doing the exact same fundamental thing, converting a portion of one human life into a resource somebody else gets to plan around, in exchange for survival, protection, or a paycheck. The names changed. Kings became lords, became factory owners, became employers. The core transaction never really did. None of this means work itself is some kind of trick, or that you should feel bad for having a job, building things, contributing, being useful to the people around you. That's genuinely part of being human, and it long predates kings and grain and clocks. The uncomfortable part isn't work, it's the schedule, it's the specific, externally imposed number. 40 hours, 5 days, 9 to 5, that was never chosen by your body, your instincts, or the 15 to 20-hour rhythm your species spent most of its existence living by. It was chosen by people who needed your time to be predictable, so they could build something, whether that something was a pyramid, a road network, or a quarterly earnings report. So the next time Sunday night rolls around, and that specific familiar dread starts creeping in before the work week has even begun, it might help to know what you're actually feeling. It isn't weakness. It isn't a personal failure to appreciate a good job. It's a few 100,000 years of a very different rhythm, quietly recognizing that something about this arrangement is relatively new and was never really designed around you in the first place. It was designed around grain and surplus and kings who needed reliable hands long before anyone had ever heard of a weekend. You're not lazy. You're not entitled. You're not failing to adapt. You're remembering a version of time that belonged to you first.